Welcome back to New Life Church's Life Group Training Sessions, where our goal is to empower and equip you to have the best life group ever. Now, my name's Kurt. I'm one of the staff here at New Life Church, and today we're going to continue on the topic of dealing with challenging conversations. Yuck. No one likes to have them. But here's what I've learned in over the last 20 years of leading staffs, volunteers, life groups, and even when I worked in the secular marketplace, is that the only way to get better at having difficult conversations is actually by having them, by preparing for them, and by adding new skill sets to this like Batman utility belt of communication. In those 20 years of ministry, I've had some difficult conversations go really, really well. I've also had some that I wish I could take a redo on. Today, I want to share with you something that I recently learned. These concepts I learned from a person named Carolyn Taketa. She's a leadership and small group expert, and she shared a framework that I thought was so helpful when approaching high-stakes conversations or conversations that could escalate. She called these skills the 6 C's of communication. These are things for you to think about and to consider before and during a high-stakes conversation. The 6 C's of communication are this. It's clarity, it's courage, calm, compassion, curiosity, and commitment. These 6 things are great things to know and to keep in mind before and during one of these conversations. So let's look at these 6 C's of communication together. The first C is clarity. When you enter into a difficult conversation, ask yourself this: what do I want out of this conversation? What is my goal? At the end of the conversation, this is what I want to be different, or this is what I want to be understood. To be able to actually state, this is how I want things to be going forward. Here's the saying that I once heard, is that clarity is kind to yourself and the other person. So be clear with yourself as to what your goal is, so you don't get distracted midway through the conversation about other things that the other person might bring up. It'd be so easy to rabbit trail. The next question you want to ask yourself is, why do I feel dread about this conversation? What happened? How do I feel about this conversation going into it? And how does this, actually what happened, impact how I feel about myself and about the other person? I would encourage you to set boundaries about what this conversation is about and what it's not about. If things start to rabbit trail, simply say a statement like this: I would be happy for us to have a conversation about that at a different time. And I'd be open to hearing your feedback. But today, I would really like us to stay on the topic and then restate your goal. Guys, I want to encourage you, don't flatter them in the course of this conversation or make them think that things are okay when they're not. If things were okay, you wouldn't be having this conversation. Here's what the truth is. The truth in love will actually help set people free. Now, the second one is courage. And that is, how are you showing up? Guys, here's one of the things I've learned by reading some different books, but being vulnerable is actually being brave. Where you show up as you are, regardless of the outcome. Guys, I know that can be so hard. I remember a time when I was vulnerable and that person used it against me later in a conversation. It's risky, but it's worth it. If you don't know something in the course of a conversation, just admit it. If you're afraid, just acknowledge it. Maybe you could say something like this: I'm afraid of how this honest conversation between us is going to impact the future of our relationship. But I'm having this conversation because the relationship with you, it matters to me. So say what you want, ask for it, take agency and responsibility, and just say something like, here's what I desire to be the outcome of this conversation. Now, the third one, and sometimes one of the hardest things to do in a crucial conversation, is to be calm. In a high-stakes conversation, it can be difficult to stay calm and not to let your emotions and your feelings get hijacked. But here's some things to think about before and in the midst of a tough conversation. I love this verse right here in Psalm 46:10. It says this, it says, "Be still and know that I am God." He is God. He's above it all. He controls all things, including this conversation. So you can relax and rest in the fact that God's already gone ahead of you, and He's going before you, and He's going behind you, and He's going to be along with you the whole way. In Exodus 14, I'm reminded of this verse that says that the Lord will fight for you. Just be still. So when you're engaged in a high-stakes conversation, it's really good to be checking in with yourself along the way. A great question to ask yourself is, Kurt, how are you feeling about this conversation? We can be full of contrasting feelings when entering into a conversation like this. One thing I've learned is that reacting in a calm way always impacts the other person in a calming way. People can tend to mirror our emotional state when in conflict. If you're conversational about it, most of the time they will be conversational about it. If you go on the attack, run. If you go on the attack, you gotta run, because they will bring even more firepower to the conversation. And then all things just escalate from one thing to the next. So be calm. Don't rush the conversation. You can get careless in a conversation when you try and rush through a conversation like this. Another tip is just to keep a neutral face. Remember, body language is speaking all the time. If you get flustered and you're reflecting that, they're gonna see that. Or if you don't like what they said and you fold your arms and you sit back, it just communicates. Everything in a conversation communicates. And we communicate more by our body language than we do by actually the words that we say. Or if you're getting angry and you're expressing that through microaggressions, it's all communicating. So for more information about the impact of this, I want to encourage you to check out our video on high stakes conversations. There's this insightful book called Emotional Agility by Dr. Susan David, and she says in this book, she says, emotions, they're data, they're not direction. Emotions are data, not direction. Sometimes just because you feel something, it doesn't mean to go there. Just because you're feeling something, it doesn't mean that it's true. Instead, allow it to make you curious with yourself about, why am I feeling this way? Why did this trigger me so much? I want to encourage you, be non-reactive, or be as non-reactive as possible. Let's be honest, that can be really challenging. I've been in hundreds of high stakes conversations due to the roles that I've held. Whenever people become reactive, I'm just telling you guys, it never leads to the outcomes you desire. When we become reactive, it tends to escalate, and it causes the need for additional conversations due to the outcomes of what happens when people become reactive. So, which leads us to our fourth C. Our fourth C is compassion. One thing that helps with compassion for the other person is to get perspective from them. Thinking about this, even before you have the conversation, what is their experience before or even during this conversation? Even asking for perspective along the way. So when we were in that situation, what were you thinking or feeling? That's a great question to ask. Or ask, what else was going on in your world that day that could have impacted our interaction or caused that behavior? I mean, how many of you guys have come home and you go to deal with your spouse and all of a sudden you treat them in a way that might be a little harsh? Well, maybe you treated them harsh not because of what they actually did. It was actually something that happened at work. And then all of a sudden you just kind of got escalated. Here, think about this, guys. The word compassion, it actually comes from the Latin word meaning to suffer with. When we show compassion, we literally come alongside another person and we work to help lead both of us out of a difficult place. Often when someone does something that offends us or impacts us, we get all spun up because we forget we sin too. We struggle too. We say the wrong things from time to time. We offend others too. Sometimes we lack emotional intelligence or situational awareness. This is something I think about and pray about when I'm in these situations. God, help me to forgive this person who sins differently than me. If you've wounded somebody along the course of the way, I want to encourage you, just own that you've wounded them. Don't say, I'm sorry I made you feel that way, or I'm sorry that it looks that way to you. Those are not apologies. They take no ownership. It also extends no compassion or empathy towards the other person. Instead, you can simply say this: I can see how my actions and my words have hurt you and impacted you, and I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? Those words are so powerful if you'll just express those to another person. Now, the fifth C is curiosity. Get curious when they hold a view that's different than yours. If they experience something different than you, get curious about it, investigate it, don't prosecute it. Why does this other person hold this view? Is there anything else you'd like to share with me about that? Because I really want to hear you today. Listen actively to hear their heart. James 1:19 tells us this: be quick to listen, slow to speak. Proverbs 16:24 says this, I love this. It says, gracious words are like a honeycomb. Their sweetness to the soul and health to the body. I like to think about this. Jesus came to this well and he asked this woman for a drink from the well. And he asks this woman some questions about her life and her story, and he makes some observations. Then he asks a few more questions, and those questions help lead this woman to life. He says to this woman, I have water to give you that will rise up inside of you, that will actually lead to harmony with God. He doesn't condemn her for her past. He doesn't shame her for all the men that she had been with. He doesn't put her down or call her names. He doesn't use infinitives like you always do this or you always do that. And her life was forever changed from that one conversation. And so it can be with someone that you're having a conversation with. Their life and the trajectory of their life could totally change from this one conversation. Now, the sixth C is this, it's commitment. And so what is the next step to strengthen this relationship? What's the next step that you guys need to take? So say it and follow through with it. So here's what you could say. You could say, here's what I'd like to see happen moving forward, or here's what I commit to moving forward. If things in this conversation are getting heated, we can always just name the elephant in the room. Like, guys, honestly, this conversation is getting a little intense. So what I'd like to do is I'd like for us to pause for a moment, and can we come back to this at a later time? That is just simply stating a next step. It got heated, let's cool down, and let's meet back in a determined amount of time. Our commitment to the relationship, guys, it really transcends our differences. So commit to one another and then ask, what's the follow-up? Is there another conversation needed? There's this really powerful story. It's actually in the Gospels in John 15. Peter has betrayed Jesus, and he did it around a campfire. A little teenage girl asked him, weren't you one of Jesus' followers? He said, no, I didn't know him. And actually we know that Peter denied Jesus 3 different times. Well, in John 15, it captures this beautiful story where Jesus has risen from the dead, and Peter's out fishing, and Jesus calls to Peter, and he calls Peter to the same place where Peter once denied him. He calls him back to a campfire, and he says basically, Peter, your past and the ways you've denied me, it doesn't matter. What he says is, do you love me, Peter? Peter says, yes, Lord, I love you. And he goes through all these different ways of saying different words for love. But ultimately at the end of it, Jesus says, do you love me? And he says, yes, Lord. And he says, go and feed my sheep. He gives him the next step. He's like, hey, the past is past. What's happened has happened. And he recommits to Peter in that moment about what their relationship was all about. And he just says, do you love me? And then he gives him a next step. So the 6 C's of communication are, again, guys, and I want you to get this. It's clarity, it's courage, it's calm, it's compassion, it's curiosity, and it's commitment to the relationship. I really hope these 6 things will help you next time you head into a challenging or difficult conversation. Remember to try not just to head into difficult conversations without thinking through these 6 things. Guys, thank you so much for spending time with us today. If you found this video helpful, I want to encourage you to go check out some of our other training videos that we have created for you, our life group leaders. Guys, we'll see you next time.